Hi everybody, how are you doing? I hope you're well and things are going smoothly. Well, it's only about 4 weeks until Paper 2, 2025, as of the time of recording, and I thought that it was time really for us to think about looking at past papers, looking at patterns, looking at what might or might not come up, to come up with some focus areas. So, let's crack on.
Alright, so starting with approaches, let's just pick through what's happened over the years. Okay, so last year we had a 4-marker on the psychodynamic approach. That was, I think, it was about the superego and the ego. We had a bit about Wundt, that might have been introspection. We had a little bit about the features of the biological approach, that was on neurochemistry. We had a bit of humanistic stuff going on, that was application. And then we had an 8-marker asking us to do some comparison of operant conditioning and social learning theory. I'm not going to talk through each year by year, you'll see it coming up on the screen, so I'll just sort of cycle through this and then we can talk a little bit about some possible patterns or possible focus areas. Okay, so what do we notice? Research methods came up in 2019 linked to this topic, but other than that it hasn't. That sort of makes sense, I suppose, because research methods has its own section on paper 2, so you're going to be seeing it anyway. Possibly a 16 marker. It has happened early on in the history of assessment here, so you can see 2017, 2018, 2020 there were 16 markers. We haven't had one for approaches for a few years now, so that feels to me like something that could happen this year. There will probably only be one 16 marker on paper 2 because research methods is half of it, remember, but I know some people like to try and think about where it will fall. Okay, in terms of topics then, we can see that psychodynamic in some form has come up every year, so it seems reasonable to expect that there'll be something on the psychodynamic approach again next year. Why not? Humanistic equally is relatively common but not as common. In terms of key areas then, if you're feeling like you need a particular topic to focus on, I would go with the cognitive approach. We haven't seen an awful lot of that for a few years. We had a 1 marker there in 2023, as you can see, but before that it was, where are we? Wow, is that 2018 really? Okay, it's been a long time, so long overdue. Could be a 16 marker on the cognitive approach. We haven't seen that much comparison over the last few years of papers, so I know we had it last year, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some comparison again this year. So prepare for that, as well as just a straightforward 8 marker or 16 marker on the cognitive approach. Could even be an application one, so see if you can maybe have some thoughts about that. Classical conditioning I've picked out as well as a possible focus area. I know we had operant conditioning last year, but classical conditioning we haven't seen that much of. I don't see that being a big essay or a big focus because we have had a couple of 16 markers on behaviourism come up a few years ago, but classical itself, potentially a bit of application or a couple of key maybe bits about the work of Pavlov, possibly. Okay, let's move on. Right, so let's have a little look at Biocycle now and what's happened with that. So last year there was a little bit of embedded research methods and then quite a lot of focus on the endocrine system really. So we had a 4 marker on hormones and we had a couple of marks of fight or flight response. And then the 16 marker was on Biocycle last year. It was on endogenous pacemakers and exogenous zeitgebers. And I think it was about how they influenced the sleep-wake cycle. So a fairly generic, really, question on EPs and EZs. And then if we just pick through the few years before that, you can see we had a lot of 16 markers on this section. We had one on plasticity and recovery. That might have been an application one. Might have been, can't remember. Before that, we had a 16 marker on localization of function. We had a 16 marker on scanning. And then when we sort of go back to the early years of this specification, you can see we had an 8 marker on split brain research. We had a 16 marker that was sort of split between localization and lateralization. So that's your split brain again. We had before that an 8 marker on rhythms and an 8 marker on scanning in the first paper on this spec. So where does that leave us? Well, it's a tricky one because, as you'll see, I've picked out a few different things here. But I'm feeling like this probably isn't a 16 marker this year. As I said, I feel like that is possibly more likely for approaches. So you could see, a build-up of maybe some smaller questions here, maybe even an 8 marker on maybe split brain research. As you can see, we haven't had much on split brain recently, so that could make sense. Maybe discuss research on split brain patients, 8 marks. Or it could be maybe something else, so maybe a 6 marker, evaluate split brain research. Yeah, so have a look at that. It could be that we see something small on ultradian/infradian rhythms. We haven't really seen a lot of that for a long time, so potentially a little one on that. We haven't seen much on synaptic transmission, or I guess, bits of the synapse and how all that works. Maybe summation might be something for you to look at. Haven't seen that for a while. Scanning techniques, maybe. We had it not that long ago as a 16 marker. But nothing in the last couple of years, and it was only a 1 marker the year before that. So maybe something small on that. Maybe even a bit of comparison. How would you feel if it was something like explain one difference between fMRI and EEG? Or, maybe 4 or 6 marks, compare them. Maybe. Localization of function, again, we had it in 2022 as a 16 marker, but not a lot since. Possibly something small on that. It could even just be explain what we mean by localization of function. Could be a little sort of diagram, or it could be a bit more applied. Paper 2 does have a lot of application. It could be about if you've got a patient who's got damage to a particular part of the brain, then what would maybe be the behaviours or the effects on their behaviour that you would see. So go over not only where the bits of brain are, but their functions as well. And maybe something on plasticity, either the processes specifically, so how plasticity occurs, or maybe outline research on brain plasticity, maybe for 3 marks or something like that. Don't see it being a big question, but those are some areas that I've picked out as possible smaller focus areas for Biopsych. Okay, so research methods slightly different because there's so much of it, and a lot of the spec does get tested, so there's not much point, because we'd be here forever going through what came up, question by question. But what I have looked at is when the design a study question has been asked, which is your big sort of 9 or 12 mark question for research methods. So we didn't see it last year. It's fairly common. You can see it's been tested 5 times there, so it could be something that they put back in this year. And what I've done is gone through the spec and looked at things that seem to come up quite a lot, so I'm going to put those up on the right there, and then things potentially that haven't come up maybe last year that could be a bit more of a focus for this year. Okay, so I've picked out observations, case studies and correlations as your sort of your actual sort of research methods and techniques. It could be that design a study question is actually design an observation. I've also picked out variables, control and bias. They sort of all go together, but that's your stuff like your IV and your DV, your extraneous variables. You're using things like randomization, standardization, reducing investigator bias, demand characteristics, that sort of thing. I've also picked out reporting and peer review. Didn't see that last year, so don't be surprised if you see it this year. Maybe describe the role of peer review or evaluate the role of peer review. Maybe you could get given some information about a book or a journal article and asked to write a reference, that sort of thing. Features of science, I think that's quite an important part of this topic, but didn't really see it last year, so be thinking about your things like falsifiability and objectivity, empiricism, stuff like that. And finally, the impact of psychology on the economy. Didn't really see that pop up last year, so could be something small on that. In terms of common focus areas, things that seem to come up quite a lot, make sure you are up to par with your hypotheses, your null, your alternatives, your directional, non-directional, all that sort of stuff. Sampling methods, strengths and limitations of them, so how you get your participants. Types and designs of experiments, validity and reliability, so going over things like your face validity, your concurrent validity, inter-observer reliability, how you check it, all of that sort of stuff. Expect, because it's pretty much always there, some handling data, maybe averages, interpreting a table or explaining, a standard deviation or something like that. And of course, your stats testing. Never neglect that. That's probably going to be on all 3 papers. Cool. That's that.
And if, like everybody else, you need to practice your research methods, then you can do it with the help of the sponsor of today's video, me. That's right, I've put together a book available on Amazon now, link in the description, of practice questions with suggested answers for research methods. It's over 9 hours worth of exam questions. You might think that's a good thing or you might think that's a bad thing, but get your practice in. Each set of questions, exam-style questions, they come with a STEM, they come with a scenario like they would in the exam about all sorts of exciting things like schizophrenia and forensic psychology, a bit of issues and debates, all sorts of stuff there. But it is all paper 2 questions aimed at helping you practice your research methods. All original questions written by me, model answers written by me. All right, so if you want to support the channel or you just want to get some practice in, there you go, links in the description. Thank you.
Okay, so just some other sort of things to be aware of and a bit of learning from last year. Comparison. Be prepared for anything. AQA do say that students need to be prepared to compare potentially anything across the course. And while they're not deliberately trying to catch people out, you could see comparison questions, I suppose, in paper 1 or paper 3. So we'll maybe talk about that another time. But in terms of your paper 2, I don't think many people expected the comparison question that came up last year, which leads me into the second point, that classical conditioning and operant conditioning, just be aware that they can be tested separately. So we saw that 8 marker on operant conditioning, comparing with a different approach last year. So look out for that, and that's why I've specifically picked out classical conditioning as a possible focus area for this year. Application of approaches. Paper 2, as I've said, is very application heavy. Approaches lends itself to application. Last year we saw lots of application of the humanistic approach. Potentially, that could be flipped around this year, and maybe some application questions on psychodynamic ideas, maybe the psychosexual stages, or maybe even defense mechanisms. Know the keywords on the spec for each approach. Again, learning from last year, I think maybe a few people got caught out with the question specifically about the role of neurochemistry. Well, neurochemistry is named on the specification alongside the biological approach, so look out for that. In terms of the biological approach, just while I'm on it, evolution is another keyword that's put on the spec with that. So they could very easily ask you to explain the role of evolution with reference to a behaviour. Don't get caught out. Distribution, significant stats testing. This is an area that I know some people don't like, but when this comes up, it can be worth a lot of marks. So do go over it and don't get caught out. As I've said already, AQA do say that this is a very application heavy paper, so just be aware and do practice those application skills. Okay, final points. Only AQA know what AQA will do. Okay, there's nobody that is making videos like this or predictive papers or anything like that. Then they're not anything to do with what AQA are actually going to do. Take what we're doing with a pinch of salt, and the reason that I'm going through it like this with you and showing you what has and hasn't come up and where the big questions are is really so that you can draw your own conclusions. Yeah, all I'm doing is exactly what everyone else can do, looking at the patterns, looking at how the papers have been asked, and just drawing my own conclusions. So as I said, take it all with a pinch of salt and make sure that you've looked at everything. You also need to reflect on what it is that you personally need to focus on. Yeah, there might be areas that I haven't really talked about, but if it came up, that you might really, really struggle with. So you need to do something about that. Don't forget your calculator. Yeah, that's an easy way to lose marks. Keep an eye on time. Remember, you get an hour for research methods. There is a lot of reading there. Make sure you break down those questions really carefully. Think about applying to the context that you're given. Box or underline the command words. It takes a second or less than a second, but it can really draw your attention to the demands of the question. Remember that if you're doing some extended writing, that it's about quality as much as anything else. If you write loads of weaker points, you might not actually get any more marks. Yeah, you need to level up the quality of it, having a thorough, effective discussion. And going back to knowing the keywords on the spec, don't just rely on common sense answers. So if you look at what you've written and actually on reflection you think, well, anybody could have written that, there's no psychology in there, then don't expect any marks for it. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. We've talked through the things that have and haven't come up on paper 2. I hope that's been useful and you can draw your own conclusions from it if you like. If you want to support the channel and help me keep doing what I'm doing, there are links in the description. Even just, a like, a comment, a subscribe would go a long way, so I really appreciate that. Do explore what else is out there. I've got some keyword sort of quiz videos that will help with paper 2. I am putting together, if I haven't already done so by the time I put this out, some videos about sort of answering essays and application stuff that would be helpful for paper 2. I've got research methods videos about stats testing and stuff like that, designing a study. So yeah, explore. I hope you find some useful stuff. Thanks very much, everybody. Good luck. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again soon.